All right, so I want to invite you guys to this community where you're going to understand all things there are to know about real estate. If you're looking at making millions as an investor, or if you're looking at getting into real estate, the pros and the cons of being licensed as an investor, being unlicensed, you name it, there's going to be a series of videos discussing all of this. But today we're going to focus on the Pace Morby or the Subto community buying properties subject to. And how, what does that look like on the buyer side, the seller side, the pros, the cons, and just really breaking it down step by step on how you as an investor, your very first deal, how you would structure that. Well, first off, you're going to want to get help. And so by all means, reach out and I'm happy to help you guys via the phone or whatever. Just get a hold of me. I'll walk you through it myself. But here's the idea or the overall concept. And then I'll break it down into some more steps and then really just bring it home with what does that mean for you guys. So ultimately, when you're looking at buying property with zero or low money down, you see it all the time. Now, what does that mean? You see the signs on the side of the freeway, I buy houses fast, I buy houses cash, or whatever the case may be. What does that mean in this scenario? So you look at buying property subject to, okay? So you'll hear this by Pace or by these different programs out there, but what you're buying is subject to the seller's current financing. Okay, so what that means is that seller has a first mortgage on the property and you're buying it with an all-inclusive trust deed. So think about it this way. The seller, if he owned it free and clear, would carry your financing. The seller would act as the bank, okay? But in this scenario, the seller has a first mortgage on it. And so that seller is going to carry, he's still going to carry a first on the property. However, the first is held by the bank. And so you're going to wrap that loan, okay? So you're going to hear this terminology time and again, called different things, the AITD, a wrap or whatever. But the simple way to understand that is the seller has a mortgage and you are going to, he's going to carry that mortgage but pay off his loan. So he has a loan on the seller carry. I guess that's still not very clear, but ultimately that just know that if the seller owned it free and clear, he's your bank. However, in this scenario, he has a loan and you're carrying it subject to the first trust deed, which is called an all-inclusive trust deed, or you're going to wrap the first. So if you're going to wrap that first, let's go ahead and say the first is 500, but the seller wants 600 for his house. Okay, and so that seller is going to have a second of 100 for a total of 6. All right, and so yeah, not quite too not ideal in the subject to community or the Pace Morby plan, but very rare are you going to find a seller just walk away with $0. Okay, now I'm sure it's out there, and or they wouldn't be selling that course, but when I'm talking about 0 to low money down, it's still in that world of becoming low money down. And so in this scenario, that first remains on the property. Got that? The seller then is going to carry a second mortgage of 100 grand, or you're going to come in with some money and pay, say you're going to put down 50 grand. So you come out of pocket 50 to take over this loan and he carries 50. Whatever the case may be, whatever that second is, this is what the seller's going to carry. So you're going to wrap the first mortgage and he's going to carry the rest. All right. 500 stays in place. You have a second on the property of whatever you guys agree on. All right. AITD, or you can do the same concept in a land contract. Now, this has kind of gone out of style of late. This was what they, when I got in the industry, it was more land contract than anything. And now I'd say it's kind of reverted to the all-inclusive trust deed, AITD, probably the most common, but you can do either one. In this scenario, the seller stays on the property until this loan is paid off. And in the AITD, this actually transfers title to you or the new buyer. In this scenario, the seller remains on title. So either way, you're going to wrap this loan into this scenario, or you can look at it this way. So let's go ahead and say now the owner owns this property free and clear, and same thing is going to apply. Now you're just going to go normal seller financing, no need for a wrap. He owns it free and clear. He's going to carry it for you, as opposed to going to the bank. You can just go to the seller. The seller's going to carry 600 grand at whatever it is, 5% interest. Still better than going to the bank and getting, 6.5%, 7.5%, whatever your rate would be on that property. Seller's happy because they're making their rate of return, whether it be they're tired of being a landlord or they just want cash flow and they're whatever the case would be, they don't need the 600 grand, but they want the monthly income. And so there's different reasons why you do each of these scenarios. But like breaking this down into a way that would make sense for anybody that would be trying to do this, which, I'm not an attorney, just a broker. So if you are getting into this world, contact a broker, have them handle it for you, or at least call an attorney if you want to go directly to the seller. However it is, but just know that I'm not an attorney, and so this is not legal advice by any means. With that being said, this is not hard. It just takes a minute for the seller to understand what the pros and what the cons are. Because if you're looking at this and say, that the con being that the first mortgage is going to have a due on sale clause on their note. And so if they sell the property changes title, then that bank becomes aware they could call the note due. And so now you got to figure out what's your plan if that happens. You want to know this at the very beginning before you get this far down. But if that if that lender calls the note, are you going to refi or are you going to sell? Okay. You have to have that in place, I would say, before you make any decisions to protect yourself and to protect the seller. Ultimately, you don't want to put anybody in harm's way if that does happen. Now, calling the note due, it'd be rare, few and far between, but you have to understand that that is a possibility and you have to be prepared for that if that does happen. But ultimately, this is not difficult because as a seller, you're selling the house normally, right? You're going to do all the contracts, the purchase agreements, the disclosures, the whole thing. Property closes escrow and you sell, you move on. You happen to just be the seller financing and you're just wrapped by the first trust deed. So this is the subject to way, the Subto model that Pace promotes. It's not rocket science, but there are some intricacies that you're going to want to know. And so if you do want to get into this type of an investing world, reach out to me, whether you're an agent or whether you're just an investor. I'll help you on both sides of the transaction, because you might take this model and you might flip it into a cash buy, or you might flip it into something else. And so one of the questions I just received was, how can I do this with no money or low money down today if I don't know what I'm doing, right? So the hardest part in all of this is finding the seller willing to do that. And so how do you go about finding that seller? You can go on different sites. You can go on Property Radar and look at people that are in notice of default, notice of sale. You can go on different sites, look at life changes, whether it be a divorce, a death, a probate sale, or whatever. The different reasons why sellers would consider this type of option. You can go find for rent by owners, someone that's renting their house out, or just investors, second homes. And so let's go find a landlord that's just tired of being a landlord and they just want to sell, but they like the cash flow. So they're like, okay, well, I'm going to sell this, get out of being a landlord, and I'll just take the cash flow, right? So you can find this on Property Radar. You can find this on, you can go buy data from Redex. You can go contact expired listings. You can go to Force Fizbos. There's all kinds of way that you can find this data, and it's just about finding the seller. And so I guess that is going to be the big question, is how do you do that? Whether it be straight up, you can start cold calling. get your scripts ready to understand what you're going to say to these sellers, why the benefit for them versus selling on the open market versus selling normally without financing, or whatever the case may be. So you got to understand who you're dealing with. So ask questions. Come at this with some authenticity, with some empathy, to really dig into what's not just in your best interest, but what fits the seller's needs as well. And so if there's a meeting of the minds that fits your best interest with the seller's needs, it's a win-win. But how else do you do that? You can definitely just start hitting the phones. You can type in and do make Google ads. The old school way of just doing Google ads, or make Facebook videos, or whatever the case may be, about how you want to try to get these sellers. So this seller now is in trouble. They are Googling, a fast cash offer. They're Googling how to sell my house fast, or whatever. Like, they're looking for a way to get out, and you happen to have the ad that's going to say, "I'll buy your house today, and here's how." Right? So they call you, and you can get the Google ads. Or you call them, you reached out to the expireds or FSBOs or NODs or whatever it is. There's ways to find these sellers. And then once you find the seller, this is probably, no joke, the hardest part. Then this is what scares people, but probably the easiest part. Either way, I can walk you through both ends of this, right? You have the finding of the seller, and you have the how of the deal. Again, it's not rocket science, but it's not quite easy if this is your first time. So definitely reach out. I'll walk you through this scenario, how to do it, who to call, how to call them, what to say. If you're buying these properties from the seller, you're not going through a traditional bank, and so you don't need to get the normal pre-qualifications. You don't need 2 years tax returns, a good credit score, or whatever. You just need something that's going to have the seller believe in your ability to pay back this loan, right? So there are different CFPB laws, if you're doing a lot of these, that you may want to look into. Again, I'm not an attorney, so definitely understand what laws are out there if you're not breaking any. But if you're in this world and you're doing a ton of them, you should know that anyways. If you're doing 1 or 2, they won't really apply to you. But if you're doing a lot of these, they may. And so you don't need to worry about your credit. You don't need to worry about anything at all, except for selling the seller this scenario and why it fits their needs. So in a market like we have today, I guess the question is why would a seller do this, right? If the market is softening and the rates are high, right? So let's say the rates right now are at 7%. I don't know what day you're going to see this video, but they're around high 6s, low 7s. And the seller has a loan of, call it 3%. One of the scenarios is, now seller says, look, I need to sell. My house is worth 800 and I owe 800. I can either sell and cash out, pay off my loan, all as well, or I can sell at a 5% interest rate. This guy the buyer stoked because they're at 5, not 7, and that seller's making the arbitrage between 3 and 5, so they're making 2% on their money. And that's one scenario. Or they're in default and they're in trouble and they have to get out. Or they're in a different life situation where they just inherited a property and they want to sell and not be responsible to be a landlord, but they want to sell and still have the cash flow. Or again, they're a landlord and they're just tired of being a landlord, so they want to sell, keep the cash flow, get rid of the landlord headache, and just have that 5% return month over month. So there's different reasons why a seller would partake in this different deal. And that's why it's harder to find the seller willing to do that. But these deals do exist. So that's the whole thing about zero to low money out of pocket, is they're hard to find. Because if you're offering a cash offer for a seller, it's probably more enticing for them just to be done, and they're willing to take less, call it, say it's worth that 800, and you're able to give them 700 or whatever. They may do that to get out of it quickly. And so there's every scenario for every seller is going to be different. that's why when you approach this, you're going to want to approach this from the mindset of curiosity, the mindset of asking questions, the mindset of not making, what's great for you. Try to bring in empathy for the seller situation, understanding where they're at, and see if these two work. Because again, not every deal is going to be subject to. You might flip it and go for a cash offer. You might flip it and go, if you're an agent, list it, or right. So there's different scenarios for different things, but being an agent allows you the multiple options, whereas being an investor, you're limited to either doing this or doing the wholesaling, and then we can go over wholesaling later. But you can now wholesale and buy the property for $7, flip that contract for $750, and you make 50 grand. That buyer's happy, whatever. So you can get into wholesaling, cash offers, different scenarios for different sellers. But that's important to know what options are out there. So when you are discussing this with the seller, you got to be able to explain to them the good, the bad, and the ugly, because as a licensed agent, it's my responsibility to advise first and foremost. Unlicensed, you don't have that same obligation because you're not held to that standard. Whereas as a licensed agent, you're held to a higher standard. I have to explain to that seller that their house is worth $800, why I only pay $700, and try to get them to bite off on that. Now, in some scenarios, again, that seller might be happy to walk away with $7 in their pocket just to be done. Let's go ahead and say there's repairs beyond their skill level, beyond whatever they want to do. They're out of the state. Someone passed away. It was inherited. Again, a bunch of different scenarios for different sellers, but in this is just a subject to seller financing video, and we can get into the wholesaling and the different scenarios later. But again, finding these sellers all revolves around how to find the sellers, whether it be cold calling, Google, Facebook, calling expires, calling for sale by owners, whatever the case may be. Finding these sellers in any scenario is going to be the tough part. So do your due diligence, understand all the different scenarios. So when you are making these calls, you can really understand and figure out what's best for all parties involved. What are the risks involved, right? So let's go ahead and talk about that for the buyer and the seller. As a seller, you're responsible for your first mortgage. As the buyer, if that note is called due, you need to figure out how to pay that off. If you can't, now it's a seller risk, because that seller, no matter what, is still responsible. They are on the loan. The buyer is now on title, but the seller now has to foreclose on that buyer. There's got to be some level of trust involved. That's why when you see these deals with the zero money out of pocket, it's hard to understand, because as a buyer, the buyer walks away, seller is holding the bag, and they're 100% responsible, whereas the seller is 0% responsible. It's a bad situation if that does happen. So that's why when you are going into this, it's important to understand what a due on sale is all about. If in the event of a buyer default, what's their responsibility? Yes, the seller can foreclose, but they have to foreclose and still be responsible for that first mortgage. Now, with that being said, that's why in some scenarios you hear about a land contract. In this scenario, the seller is still on title. They have more power just to evict, and they have more of an agreement that is in a way that the seller is still responsible for the first mortgage, but they have more liberty to get rid of that buyer that's defaulted. And so they have more control in a land contract. So very little risk, sadly, for the buyer, a lot of risk for the seller. Now let's go ahead and up that. And so now the buyer comes in with, say the buyer comes in with 50 grand. Okay, and they put the 50 grand down to the seller. Seller now is carrying the first, and the buyer has 50 grand in. There's a due on sale, and now the bank calls a note due. You have to have an exit strategy to either sell or refi to keep that 50 grand, because if you default on that, the seller still forecloses, you're out 50 grand. So there is risk the more money that the buyer puts in. That's why if you are the seller, you're going to want some kind of money from the buyer involved in this transaction to kind of hold them accountable to making sure this first is paid off somehow, some way, whether it be on a refi or on a sale. So you have to be, know your risks moving in to something like this. But as a seller, land contracts are typically a little safer and they have more control over that scenario. Okay, so again, so if that buyer defaults on the first loan, okay, the seller now has to foreclose on the buyer. If the seller defaults on his responsibility of paying the first mortgage and the bank forecloses on the buyer, right, or the bank forecloses on the seller, the buyer is the one holding the bag, is going to lose their 50 grand unless they can refinance or sell the property. And so there's got to be a level of trust between the buyer and the seller, which what they could do is open a joint bank account, which is recommended. And now the buyer and the seller are on this account. The checks go to the first mortgage to make sure the buyer is putting the funds in and to make sure that the seller is making that payment. If the seller defaults on the first, then the buyer just has a legal recourse against the seller, but good luck. And so there is risk, but if you're looking at coming up with zero money or just something that's low, again, this is just one of the options that you guys have available to you, but you have to come into it with eyes wide open to really understand what your risks are, because there are risks on both sides, especially depending on what the buyer brings in for their down payment money. Or you can shift it gears a little bit and talk about lease options. But I'm not a big fan of those either. I don't know. There's again, to every scenario, there'll be probably another scenario that you can run by and understand it. But in this discussion, is more about subject to and buying properties subject to the seller financing and not everything else. But just know that when you're coming into this thing with options, it would just make sense to understand it all, be able to explain it, figure out what's best for both sides. Obviously, as the investor buying subject to, you're trying to do what's best for you, but you also want to make sure you're taking care of the needs of both sides, because you don't want it to come back on either one of you, right? So as a buyer in my shoes, I want to make sure that I'm taking care of the seller, that they don't want to, I don't want them coming back to me for any wrongdoing. I'm putting my money in this account, making sure this account's on auto pay to the first transaction, and everything is going along just fine. Can the seller come in and drain that account? Have a joint signature on there where the seller can't do that, buyer can't do that. So there's some safeguards that you can put in place. Definitely call your attorney to go over any of this. If I was to do one of these, I would definitely have my attorney sign off on it and understand the risks going in for both sides. But yeah, again, this is just one option out of many. Okay, so I had some clarification on the seller's obligations and the seller's recourse against the buyer if the buyer does default. And so the question is does the seller, or does the buyer wait until the bank forecloses on the seller, or can the seller foreclose on the buyer? Well, in the case of an AITD, the property has transfer title. Okay, so the seller is now the bank. The seller then has to follow all the foreclosure laws and then foreclose on the buyer. So if the seller forecloses, they have to go through and wait all the time frames for the NOD, time frames for the notice of sale, and then the trustee sale. And so this takes approximately 120 days, at which time the seller is still responsible for that first mortgage, okay? So the seller can start foreclosure before the bank would start foreclosure. That makes sense? So in this scenario, the bank is the seller. The seller is the bank, so that the bank follows the foreclosure rules and forecloses on the buyer. Now, scenario where the seller is defaulting on the first, that first mortgage, starts foreclosure on the seller and then the buyer is out, right? So if for some reason that payment isn't getting made to the bank and then the bank forecloses, the bank is foreclosing on the seller, right? Even though the property is in the name of that new buyer, they're foreclosing on that loan, on their trust deed, okay? Their deed of trust or their trust deed is tied to this property. Even though it's in the new buyer's name, the bank is foreclosing on the property, on that note that's due. So the bank can foreclose on the seller could foreclose on the buyer. A lot of things have to happen in that scenario, but no matter what, the bank has to follow their timelines to foreclose, and the seller has to follow timelines on foreclosure because they will, in their loan documents, have that same process in place, have a trustee in place to handle notice of default, notice of sale, and the trustee's sale. And so either the bank will foreclose on the seller or seller will foreclose on the buyer in the event of a default from the buyer or the seller. And in the next video that we're going to talk about the pros and the cons of being a licensed realtor versus being unlicensed. We're going to talk about the different ways of buying other than subject to, whether it be wholesaling or whether it be cash or private financing. We'll get into all that in this next video. So stay with me, like this video, join my community, subscribe to my page, and we'll look at each of these suspects. We'll look at each of these scenarios in the next few videos.